That win in Buffalo was far more complicated than the final score suggests, and if you watched it snap by snap, you know exactly why it felt so uncomfortable. The Eagles walked out with the victory, but they did it while reopening every debate about identity, philosophy, and whether this team is winning because of its offense or in spite of it. The most jarring reality is simple and impossible to ignore. The Eagles did not complete a single pass in the second half, and yet they still beat one of the most dangerous offenses in football on the road. That alone tells you this game was less about style points and far more about survival, resilience, and an elite defense dragging the team across the finish line. If you bleed green and white, smash that like button right now, and drop a comment below. What does this win mean for the Eagles season? Go Birds! Just when it seemed like the offense might have found some rhythm and clarity earlier in recent weeks, it reverted back to its most conservative and predictable form. The second half was defined by short possessions, minimal creativity, and an approach that looked more focused on draining the clock than finishing the opponent. The numbers are brutal. 17 net yards in the second half. 0 completed passes, constant 3-and-outs that put an enormous burden on a defense that ended up playing 72 snaps. In most NFL games, that script leads directly to a loss. Against Buffalo, it somehow didn't, and that's because Vic Fangio's defense delivered one of the most dominant performances the Eagles have had in years. Since Week 10, this unit has been allowing just 14.5 points per game, the best mark in the league, and what makes that even more impressive is the quality of competition. This was not a soft stretch of opposing offenses. Buffalo came in as one of the top scoring teams in the NFL, averaging 29 points per game, and left their own stadium with just 12. Josh Allen, who had been nearly unbeatable at home in December, suffered his first home loss in that month since 2021. He still has never beaten the Eagles. The defense forced 8 straight scoreless drives and held the league's top rushing offense to just 74 yards on 20 carries by James Cook. That's not luck. That's domination. The pass rush deserves special attention. All 5 sacks came with a 4-man rush, continuing a trend that has completely changed the complexion of this defense. Over the last 4 games, the Eagles have 18 sacks while rushing only 4, more than any other team in the league. That allows Fangio to drop 7 into coverage, suffocate passing lanes, and force quarterbacks into mistakes. The results are obvious. Opposing quarterbacks are completing just 56% of their passes, even while facing elite talent. This defense is playing fast, unselfish, and in sync, and it's peaking at exactly the right time of the season. Jalen Carter's impact cannot be overstated. His block kick late in the game quite literally saved the win. If that extra point goes through, the entire ending changes. Beyond that moment, Carter looked physically stronger and more explosive than he had earlier in the year, which aligns with what he said recently about finally regaining strength and flexibility after shoulder procedures. He still needs off-season surgery, but right now he's close to full power, and it shows on film. Even more encouraging is that the defense is getting production from everywhere. Jelix Hunt has exploded over the last 4 games. Moro Ajimo has surpassed last season's production. Rookie linebacker Jayad Campbell delivered one of the best all-around performances on the field with tackles, coverage stops, a forced impact play, and relentless effort that stood out even among veterans. And yet, for all the praise the defense deserves, the offense remains the central concern. This is now the second game this season in which the Eagles failed to complete a pass in the second half, and somehow they won both. Historically, that almost never happens in the modern NFL. It speaks volumes about how dominant the defense has been, but it also raises uncomfortable questions about sustainability. The Eagles have 3 of the 10 halves with the fewest yards in the entire league this season. That's not a small sample. That's a trend. Nick Sirianni acknowledged after the game that he needs to do a better job in those moments, particularly when the team has an opportunity to close out a win. The approach in Buffalo felt like the Eagles were playing not to lose rather than playing to win, relying entirely on their defense to bail them out. Under-center play action, which was effective in the first half, virtually disappeared. Buffalo sold out to stop the run, and the Eagles rarely countered with aggression or adjustment. Predictability took over, and the offensive line, which is not as dominant as in past years, simply couldn't impose its will. The strange part is that we've seen flashes of what this offense can be when the tempo is right, the play calls get in quickly, and Jalen Hurts has time to read and adjust at the line. In the first half, there was rhythm. In the second half, that rhythm vanished. Whether it was late play calls, overly cautious philosophy, or fear of turnovers in bad conditions, the result was the same, an offense that stalled completely while holding a lead. Still, the Eagles are 11-5. They are healthy. The defense looks championship ready. The 2 seed is still mathematically in play, and the list of potential playoff opponents continues to shift week by week. There are no juggernauts in the league this season, and that reality keeps the door wide open. The question that now hangs over everything is whether this team can find enough offensive balance to complement a defense that is clearly capable of carrying them deep into January. So let me ask you this, as someone watching this team every single week, do you believe this defensive dominance is enough to overcome the offensive inconsistency when the games matter most, or do you think this approach is eventually going to cost them when the margin for error disappears? The deeper you go into this conversation, the more complicated the decision-making becomes, because this isn't just about what the Eagles did in Buffalo, it's about what they choose to do next. With the regular season winding down, the focus naturally shifts to seeding, matchups, and whether pushing for position is worth the risk. Right now, the 2 seed is still alive, but it comes with conditions. The Eagles need to take care of their own business, and they need help elsewhere. That reality forces the organization into a familiar debate. Do you chase the higher seed, or do you prioritize rest and health for a playoff run? When you look at how this team is currently constructed, the argument for rest carries serious weight. This defense has been on the field for an enormous number of snaps, especially over the last few weeks. Against Buffalo alone, they played 72 snaps, much of that coming in high-leverage situations because the offense couldn't stay on the field. Despite that workload, they still look fast, aggressive, and disciplined. That's a testament to conditioning, coaching, and depth, but it's also not something you want to test repeatedly if you don't have to. An extra week of rest could mean fresher legs, quicker reactions, and fewer soft tissue injuries when the playoffs begin. Nick Sirianni's comments strongly suggest that rest is at least being seriously considered. He framed the season as a marathon, not a sprint, and pointed directly to the value of rest and recovery. History supports that mindset. Both times Sirianni has been part of a Super Bowl run in Philadelphia, the team benefited from a bye week. That additional time allowed for healing, self-scouting, and sharpening details that matter in postseason football. This roster, particularly along the offensive line and on defense, looks like it could use that reset. There's also the emotional side of it. Watching Jalen Phillips briefly leave the Buffalo game was a reminder of how thin the margin is between a Super Bowl run and a season derailed by one injury. He returned, and everything was fine, but that moment alone is enough to make you think twice about exposing key players unnecessarily. The defense is the backbone of this team right now, and protecting it should be a top priority. At the same time, there's a very real argument for pushing for the 2 seed. Playing at home matters. The Eagles have not lost a home playoff game since the 2019 season, and Lincoln Financial Field in January is a genuine advantage. Noise, weather, familiarity, and energy all tilt in Philadelphia's favor. Securing the 2 seed would guarantee at least 2 home playoff games, and it could shape the entire path to the Super Bowl. Avoiding certain matchups early, especially against NFC West opponents, is not a trivial consideration. What complicates this even more is how unpredictable the NFC landscape has become. Teams that looked dominant earlier in the season have shown cracks. The Rams, for example, recently failed to score on their first 4 drives in a game for the first time all year. Quarterbacks are turning the ball over. Defenses are adjusting. There's no unstoppable force in this conference right now. That chaos creates opportunity, but it also demands clarity of purpose. You need to know who you are and how you plan to win in January. For the Eagles, the identity is clear on one side of the ball and still evolving on the other. Defensively, this is a Super Bowl caliber unit by every meaningful measure. They pressure with 4, they cover on the back end, they stop the run, and they generate momentum-shifting plays. Offensively, the ceiling is still there, but the floor has been uncomfortably low in key moments. The hope is that the staff knows exactly what works and what doesn't, and that some of what we saw in Buffalo was situational conservatism rather than a permanent regression. The most important takeaway from the Bills game might actually be the simplest one. The Eagles won, and they came out of it healthy. In December football, especially on the road in brutal conditions, that matters more than style points. You don't get bonus credit for winning pretty. You advance by winning, learning, and adjusting. If this team can clean up the offensive stagnation even to an average level, the defense gives them a chance against anyone in the league. Now the question becomes philosophical as much as tactical. Do you trust that this defense can carry you regardless of opponent and seeding, making rest the smarter play? Or do you believe that maximizing home field advantage is worth the risk of pushing starters one more week? That decision will tell us a lot about how this coaching staff views its own team heading into the postseason. And even after all of that, there's still one layer of this conversation that can't be ignored, because Buffalo wasn't an isolated incident. It was a magnifying glass. What happened in that second half didn't come out of nowhere, and that's why it's creating so much unease among Eagles fans despite the win. This wasn't just about weather, or protecting a lead, or playing the percentages. This was the offense falling back into habits we've already seen multiple times this season, and habits like that don't magically disappear just because the calendar flips to January. The uncomfortable truth is that the Eagles have been able to get away with this because of how absurdly good the defense has been. Winning games without completing a second-half pass should be impossible in today's NFL, yet this team has done it twice in the same season. The last time something like that happened was nearly 4 decades ago. That's not a coincidence, and it's not something you can plan to repeat against elite playoff opponents week after week. At some point, you are going to need offense to close a game, convert third downs, and put a team away instead of letting them hang around. What makes this so frustrating is that the tape clearly shows answers exist. In the first half against Buffalo, the offense used under-center play action effectively. The field was spread. Jalen Hurts had clearer reads. The ball came out on time. Dallas Goedert was involved near the goal line. A.J. Brown was creating explosive opportunities, including one that could have drawn a defensive pass interference. Those plays didn't vanish because Buffalo adjusted. They vanished because the Eagles stopped calling them. Once the Bills began selling out to stop the run, logic says you punish that aggression. Instead, the Eagles leaned into predictability, run-pass sequences, short routes on long-yardage situations, play calls that felt designed to avoid mistakes rather than create advantages. That approach puts pressure on an offensive line that, quite frankly, is not built to dominate in obvious situations this year. When the average yards before contact drops to 0 and the quarterback is pressured on 3 out of every 4 dropbacks, the system is failing the players. That's why the conversation about Jalen Hurts needs to be framed carefully. Yes, he didn't complete a pass in the second half, but context matters. Late play calls limit his ability to read and adjust. Predictable concepts allow defenses to sit on routes. When you're facing stacked boxes and man coverage without built-in answers, you're asking the quarterback to be perfect just to survive. That's not sustainable, and it's not fair to place the bulk of the blame on him. What gives this situation a strange sense of hope is that the issues feel correctable. This doesn't look like a talent problem. It looks like a philosophy problem. When the Eagles play with tempo, when Hurts is empowered at the line, and when the offense stays aggressive regardless of score, they look functional and sometimes even dangerous. When they shut it down early and play not to lose, everything tightens, and the entire team ends up walking a razor's edge. The defense has earned the benefit of the doubt. They've dominated top offenses. They've generated pressure without blitzing. They've forced mistakes and held up even when placed in unfair situations. The offense has not earned that same trust yet, and that's the tension hanging over this team as the playoffs approach. You can absolutely win a Super Bowl with an elite defense, but history shows you still need timely offense when the margin disappears. So as this season moves forward, the biggest storyline isn't just who the Eagles play or where they play. It's whether the coaching staff fully commits to an identity that complements this defense instead of leaning on it as a safety net. Because if the Eagles can find even consistency on offense, not brilliance, just consistency, this roster has everything it needs to beat anyone standing in its way. And that decision, more than anything else, is what will define how this postseason is remembered. Because when you strip everything down, this Eagles team is standing at a crossroads between 2 versions of itself. One version trusts its defense, plays conservatively, shortens games, and believes that chaos can always be survived. The other version understands that while the defense is elite, it cannot be treated like a shield to hide offensive hesitation. January football punishes indecision, and the teams that last are the ones that know exactly who they are and refuse to flinch when the pressure spikes. What's fascinating is that the Eagles have already shown they are capable of being that second version. We've seen stretches where the offense operates with urgency, where the ball gets out quickly, where play action under center forces linebackers to hesitate, and where the field is spaced in a way that actually helps the offensive line instead of exposing it. Those moments are real. They're on film. They didn't happen by accident. That's what makes the pullback in games like Buffalo so hard to understand. There's also a psychological element here that matters. When an offense goes into a shell, defenses sense it. Opponents sense it. Suddenly, every possession feels heavier. Every punt feels like an invitation. Buffalo felt that opening, even while being shut down for most of the game. In the playoffs, that belief alone can swing momentum. You don't want to give talented teams hope. You want to suffocate them, mentally and physically, and that requires at least a baseline level of offensive aggression. The irony is that the Eagles don't need to reinvent anything. They don't need to become a high-flying offense overnight. They don't need to win shootouts. They just need to stop sabotaging themselves with predictability. Even modest adjustments change the entire math of a game. 1 or 2 sustained drives in the second half against Buffalo would have flipped the script completely. Instead of 72 defensive snaps, maybe it's 55. Instead of a nail-biter, maybe it's a controlled finish. Small differences, massive impact. And that's where the coaching staff comes back into focus. Nick Sirianni took accountability after the game, and that matters. Acknowledging that the mindset was not 13 points is enough shows awareness. But awareness has to lead to action. The postseason does not reward lessons learned too late. Every possession is magnified. Every decision is dissected. The margin for error disappears, and the teams that survive are the ones that trust preparation over fear. From a roster standpoint, the Eagles are in a position many teams would envy. They have a defense that can dictate games. They have star power on offense. They have playoff experience. They have leadership in the locker room. What they don't have, at least not consistently yet, is alignment between philosophy and personnel when the game tightens. That's the final piece. Buffalo should be remembered as a turning point, not because of how ugly it looked at times, but because it exposed everything at once. The strength, the flaw, the potential, the risk. It showed exactly how far this team can go, and exactly what could stop them from getting there. Whether that message is fully absorbed will determine how this season ends. And that intensity is exactly why this moment feels so fragile and so full of possibility at the same time. Because teams like this don't come around often. A defense that can dominate games without needing help is rare in any era, especially in today's NFL where rules favor offense. What the Eagles are doing on that side of the ball is not normal, and it shouldn't be treated as something that will automatically be there every season. Windows like this are precious, and they demand urgency, clarity, and conviction from everyone involved. The danger is assuming the defense will always be able to clean up offensive hesitation. That's a bet you might win once, maybe twice, but eventually the odds catch up. In the playoffs, you face quarterbacks and coordinators who live for those moments, who adjust faster, who capitalize on every short field and every extra possession. Giving them repeated chances is playing with fire, no matter how good your defense is. That's not criticism, it's reality. What gives this team hope is that the problems are not rooted in effort or belief. You don't